Hey everyone, it's Jen.
And this is Lindsay.
And welcome back to Corpus Delicti and allergy season.
We both. I can tell you've got it too, and so do I. And I actually got my first COVID shot today. I've got that on top of it, just, the headache and stuff from that. So we sound great.
Yeah, so it's super apologies. We're going to make it through, but we could not resist recording tonight through all the obstacles that has happened the past couple of days. But we want to get started with Chapter 4, The Long Weekend.
Just to kind of set the stage here, this is the last official episode of the story. However, we do have 2 more episodes after this about Rocky's story. On Wednesday, March the 31st, we're going to have the live Q&A stream, which we're going to post on our social media pages the day of. It will be at 7 p.m. Central on Zoom. We are going to actually record that too. So please come if you can, because we need questions and conversation, and we're going to kind of discuss it and pick it apart together. But if you can't make it, we are going to record that. And then after that, we have an interview episode. We're super excited about it. We are going to hear directly from Rocky's lawyer and investigator, the current ones, his son, Leandrew, and, drumroll please, Robin Rocky Myers himself.
We worked really hard and we were able to get this nailed down, so we're super excited. In this week's episode, we are going to be talking about the aftermath. Now, Rocky's team did a great job with closing arguments. No question about it. They were incredibly thorough. They presented alternate possibilities. They were quite convincing. Meanwhile, the prosecution flat out said on several occasions that there were certain questions that they could not provide answers to, and it was much less thorough, and it took a lot less time.
I gotta be honest, when we were going through these documents, based on closing statements alone, there was just no question in my mind. It just didn't even seem comparable. But basically, the prosecution goes on this long explanation about what direct evidence is and what circumstantial evidence is. And direct evidence is going to be your DNA, your, I can prove I was here at this place type stuff. And circumstantial evidence is, well, it's just based on the circumstance. It could be explained another way. It might look bad, but technically it's not hardcore DNA, no question about it. So the prosecutor flat out says, if Miss Dutton had gotten a good look at the man who stabbed her in the side, now Miss Dutton is the cousin, remember, it would have been direct evidence. She would have seen her attacker. But he says, she didn't though, so it's circumstantial. So he goes on to say, these are kind of his points here, and this is a quote, "In this case, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, the defendant had the opportunity to commit the offense. He was across the street. Even by his own words, he was across the street at the time of Mrs. Tucker's death. He was across the street. He said he knew Miss Tucker, that he had been to the door, and I submit to you it is reasonable to assume he could have been by looking in the TV set there at the front door. He had the opportunity, he had motive, he had a bad drug habit." And then later he goes on to say, he was identified by 2 of the 3 people in the car as he was leaving Miss Tucker's residence with a stereo or the VCR under his arm.
Now let's just pause real quick, because he said he was across the street, even by his own words, at the time of Miss Tucker's death. So he was across the street. He was never in the house. His own words is misconstrued here, because he's saying, Rocky even told you he was across the street. Well, no crap, Sherlock, because
he lives there
on the other side of the road.
He's always across the street. He lives across the street. He was there lots of times. It doesn't seem very solid. But this point he brings up about 2 of the 3 people in the car, let's provide an update on this real quick. This is a good time to do this because we did come across one piece of new information. So if you think back, there were the 3 people in the car. Tyrone Elliott is the one who came forward first. He was slated to get that reward money. He was in the car with 2 other people, and they say they see Rocky. However, Tanisha Irvin is the one who yells out the window and says, hey, you stole that thing. She sees him, but she is the only one who cannot identify Rocky. Well, the new information that we found is she had actually provided a sketch. She provided a sketch to police. So this woman was certain enough about what this person looked like to provide a sketch, but that it was not Rocky, which I think is a big deal. If she was given all this detail to the police about who she saw and all that, and then when she saw Rocky, when they said, is this him? She could have been able to say, yes, that was him. So there was a sketch involved. Also, she said, their story is that they were on their way to what they call the Iranian store to get alcohol. They saw who they say is Rocky on the way, go to the Iranian store. It's closed. They go straight to 6th to the shot house. At least that is what Tyrone Elliott says. Keep in mind the one who's getting the reward money. Tanisha Irvin actually says that there was another stop in there. They went to the Iranian store, then they stopped at another store, got alcohol there, and took it to the shot house, which throws the whole timeline off even more. The other 2 who said for sure they saw Rocky just conveniently left that out. But the one who's saying, no, we did a sketch, I don't know who it is. And not only that, there was an extra stop in there. We stopped another spot. It throws the whole thing off.
Now let's go over to the defense side during their closing argument. Now he made some really good points. And he mentioned that Mamie Denton's car was parked outside, which Rocky would have seen, and he would have known that there was an unknown person in her house. Would he have taken the risk of going into a house to steal something when there's another person that could not be someone who is big or muscular or someone that would give him, resistance? And Rocky knew she did not have a husband. So when she was heard saying, my husband's in the other room, there would have been no point to that because he knew that she was a widow. And just going back, there wasn't any skin or hair from Rocky at the crime scene. He had, medical care for it, and it hurt him. That's why he wore those long sleeves. But those long sleeves aren't going to keep it all in, especially when you're stabbing somebody, because that's a force. And you're just not going to keep it all inside the shirt.
And it's on his hands, too.
We've talked about this a lot about the clothes. And in their closing argument, they said, reiterated that Rocky was wearing dark clothes and he was seen in those clothes. And the killer is seen wearing white clothes. And Rocky's also seen wearing those same dark clothes after the murder. So, would he had put on his dark clothes, left the house, changed outside of a window, walked in, committed the murder, and walked out and put back on the clothes? That doesn't add up. And the people who saw him that were released from 9:30 at the hospital, the ones that Lindsay was just talking about, their son had the asthma attack. They got checked out of the hospital, and they said it was later than what they said. They said it was 11, and it turns out to be 9:30. So we have that huge time discrepancy there. Talking through it, Rocky wouldn't have needed to go up 6th. That alley is dark. It's wooded. It's going behind houses. It's the perfect getaway.
Absolutely. If you're trying to stay under the radar because you just committed a crime, why wouldn't you go there?
Why would he go out to the front when the shot house is closer through the alley?
The next point that they hit in the closing arguments, because again, they're trying to recap everything to hit home with the jury, they talked about how when the police told Rocky that they were dusting the VCR for prints, he admitted to selling it. He's like, okay, you're right. My prints might be on it. Got to tell you about the VCR. But when they told him they dusted the house and the phone for prints, he didn't offer any reason for why they might find his prints there. He didn't say, okay, I did it. Or he could have easily covered for himself and said, okay, I was in the house one time, but it was last month. He didn't do any of that, which he easily could have. And then lastly, a lot of the people who said originally that it was Cool Breeze and then switched knew Breeze for a long time. They all could have potentially had a reason to, cover for this person they've known a long time. And this includes Tyrone Elliott, who we've said multiple times was told about the reward, and he was the person on the books to receive the reward if Rocky was found guilty. So that's what the two sides hit, which, just to reiterate, Rocky's team goes through point by point. Here's why he could not have committed this crime. The prosecution is like, it's all circumstantial evidence. There's some stuff I can't answer, but he had a motive. He was on drugs. And that's the two arguments here. So now it's time for jury deliberations. The jury is given their instructions, but before they are sent off, they are told to hurry up. They are on a time frame. They are under a time crunch because it is now January 1994. It's the Friday before Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and everyone was anxious to get their long weekend started. So they're like, you guys are going to go in there. We're all waiting on you. We've got a barbecue to go to. It's Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. Let's get this show on the road.
Not to mention that this is a death penalty case. There's not many of them in Decatur. In fact, this one was so rare, the judge borrowed the manual on how to do a death case from the defense. So you should not rush a jury whatsoever. But never. And while you think that the story is closing or getting close to the end because the trial's over, you would be very mistaken. Now, remember how we alluded to the rushing of trial back in episode 2? Well, here it comes. May Puckett is actually one of these jurors. Puckett says, coming into the deliberation room, several of the jurors were set on Rocky being guilty. They were absolutely convinced. Not surprising as they sat through the trial, but they didn't seem willing to even entertain other theories, other notions, other information. They came into the trial thinking that he was guilty. They sat through the trial, and now they were just ready to cast their vote and get out.
Now, unfortunately, some of the other jurors hadn't taken the trial quite as seriously as May Puckett had. And she says that at least one of the other jurors fell asleep several times during the trial, and they had to nudge this person to wake them up. I mean, the person is in charge of a death penalty case and is sleeping in the middle of the courtroom. But May Puckett was not at all convinced of Rocky's guilt. She said that she just never had that aha moment. And there were two other jurors who agreed with her. So they get in there. They're talking it all out. You've got some who are like, this man's guilty. I know it because I slept through it. And then you've got three others who are like, no. So there's going to be lots of back and forth, lots of discussion. And as we know here, just from listening to this, there are so many people, so many locations, different accounts, timelines. It's hard to keep up with. So at one point, the jurors say, hey, we need the transcripts. We need to review them. We need to clarify. We've got some questions. We want to make sure we're covering all of our bases. They were told no. It would be too much trouble. Again, it's Friday. We're ready to go. It's towards the end of the day. No, it would take too long to do all that. You just told the jurors, which, by the way, in the Constitution, you are entitled to a jury trial. These are the people in charge of your life in this case, whether you live or die. And you are telling them no, they can't review the frickin' information that they need to make a decision? What? Think about, Jen, the number of times that we have pulled up these documents and these transcripts and gone through it and found things that we didn't realize or that clicked later. And we've been working on this for a month and a half now. This trial took 1 week, and they were not even allowed to go back and look at it.
This is beyond me. Why the evidence, timelines, and court transcripts, maybe not court transcripts, I get that. Why can't they bring that into the deliberation room? You're asking 12 people, to go off their memory of a case that lasted a week.
Not only that, but to hurry up and do it. So not only that, they come back in after they've been in there for a while talking, and they say, hey, TikTok, hurry up. I know y'all asked us for some documents. We're not going to give you that. Go back in there and talk it through. Okay, you're talking it through, but you're taking too long. Everyone's out here waiting on you. We're ready to go. I mean, court deliberations, jury deliberations, it's not abnormal for them to take days upon days. What are we doing here?
So now we've got 3 jurors who believe Rocky is not guilty, and he's up for a possible death sentence. But they're not having any luck swaying the others who are ready to condemn him to the death penalty. And they're being pressured to get this done quickly, so they got a few choices here. Okay, 1, they can vote not guilty, knowing that it will result in a mistrial. And they're already outnumbered. And Rocky ran the risk of going back into a second trial with a jury that felt like he was guilty and he would get the death penalty. 2, they can vote guilty and recommend death, since they know they're outnumbered anyways. Or they can vote guilty and try a way to get the other 9 jurors to at least recommend life without parole. So what they are faced with are 3 choices. Both are leading to the death penalty, possibly. The first one, if they do a mistrial, it's a gamble. You don't know what you're going to get on that second trial. The least of the horrors is sentencing him to life without parole.
Because they knew there was no way they were going to be able to convince them to just find him not guilty. It just wasn't going to happen.
So they opted to do the third. They said, look, we think this man didn't do it. We don't want him to end up in another jury's hands. We'll vote guilty, but we're going to recommend life without parole. After a lot of talking about his family and kids and how they needed their father, they all agreed that they would vote guilty and recommend life without parole.
May Puckett said in an article that appeared in The Nation, we were dealing with ourselves, trying to come up with a way to save his life. That's what it boiled down to. So make particular note here that is their goal, is to say, okay, you know what? At the end of the day, guilty, not guilty, we just don't want him to be executed. They did manage to get everybody on board with the fact that there are at least a lot of questions in this case. So can we please just at least settle for life without parole? They had a very specific purpose in doing that. They come back to deliver the results and they say guilty. At this point, Rocky is shocked. Rocky genuinely comes in here believing he's going back to New Jersey. He's like, I'm going to leave Alabama, go back home. And he's shocked because he's found guilty. Then they present their recommendation for sentencing, which is life without parole. So they go off to enjoy their long weekend. They're all going to go. But here is this man, a man of color, mind you, on Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, who has just been sentenced. But now that he's been found guilty, this is the best case scenario. It's the best he can hope for, life without parole at this point.
After the jury had come back with the guilty verdict, everyone goes off on their long weekend. Well, Rocky is waiting for sentencing. They're not quick about it. They're going to wait 6 months. That's half a year to say, you know what, go face the judge. So now we come to where all of the family gets to go in front of the judge. And they get to talk about Rocky and try to see what they can do on the sentencing behalf. Now, the first up, we hear from Rocky's now ex-wife, his oldest son, Leandrew, who was 14. And Rocky had other children who were 10, 9, and 7. Now, this is from Leandrew.
And I'll be the attorney again, and Jen can be Leandrew. Again, Leandrew is 14 years old at the time, and he shows up in court for his father, which he chose to do. So this is the exchange. Do you love your father?
Yes, sir.
Do you miss him?
Yes, sir.
Do you understand that no matter what happens, because of the conviction he has entered against him here, he's not coming home? You know that, don't you?
I know that.
Are you prepared, though, to ask the jury to let your father live?
Yes, sir.
When your daddy got into drugs, did it change him a little bit?
It didn't change him towards us. I guess it changed him toward himself. He still loved us the same way.
So that takes a lot of guts for a 14-year-old kid. And he told his mom, what can I do to help my father? And he chose to go on the stand and say, let my father live. So then Debbie Myers, who is Rocky's wife, now ex-wife, but wife at the time, she comes up and they ask her why the other children weren't there. And she says they're younger and it would have been really hard on them. She basically says that, Leandrew really felt the need and the desire to do this. And she talks about how it affected the other children. It affected their grades in school. And she says, Rocky's never been violent. I knew he was on drugs. I thought he just needed help. And ever since he'd been in prison, he seemed to be back to his old self. And she's really just saying he's a good guy. There's no reason I could see him having done this. And he's just a good guy.
Rocky comes back up. He says that while he doesn't agree with the decision, he respects that the jury and the attorneys did their job. He says that since he's been in prison, he's been reflecting on his life decisions, and he was determined not to let anyone else make the same mistakes. Some of the other inmates called him Papa Rock because he would give advice and try to help them out. He also wanted to be able to continue to do so for others, and this includes his own family. And for our overseas friends, typically what happens is that the jury presents a recommendation, and that's it. Well, except for this judge, who decides to invoke a little thing called judicial override. They present life without parole. Rocky and his team are relieved, but then the judge says, no, I'm going to override your decision. Robin Rocky Myers will be sentenced to death by electrocution. Now, again, from the article in The Nation, it's quoted saying, he said that the jury had been too emotional in choosing not to recommend the death penalty and described Rocky as a threat to society. First and foremost, he has never been violent. He doesn't have any previous violent offenses filed against him. He did make a poor decision about drugs, but there are a lot of people in society that are unfortunately addicted to drugs as well. It doesn't make you a murderer.
What really just boils my blood here is what we said about the jury and how careful and strategic they were when making their decision and their recommendation. And it was made with specific care to save this man's life. And, if he did this, our decision will still hold him accountable. But if he didn't do this, we're at least not condemning him to death. That was their whole purpose.
This is the very first death sentence case this judge has ever had. This is the very first one. He didn't even know how to do it. He had to ask for help from the defense. This is his first one. So was he so set on exercising that right to condemn someone to death that it overrode his judgment in the sentencing?
Let's talk about this judicial override for a moment, because basically we know now that he came in and said, here's the recommendation. No, I'm going to one up you, basically. So clearly it can't be that common, right? It's not something that happens often if you're just going to throw out what the jury says, right? Wrong. So at the time, again, this is 1994, only 3 states still allowed it: Alabama, Florida, and Delaware. But out of the 3, Alabama was the most lenient with it. Imagine that. It wasn't really often used in Florida or Delaware. They had a lot of criteria that had to actually be met in order to use it. And then everywhere else, it was outlawed. It had actually been outlawed everywhere else since the death penalty was abolished and then brought back in 1976. So according to the Equal Justice Initiative, since 1976, Alabama judges have overridden jury verdicts 112 times. Judges have authority to override life or death verdicts, but 91% of overrides have overruled jury verdicts to life to impose the death penalty. So they're not doing it the other way. They're not saying you sentence them to death, we're going to give you mercy. They're doing it the other way. It goes on to say judicial override is a significant contributor to Alabama's high death sentencing rate. Nearly 20% of the people currently on death row were sentenced to death through judicial override. So these 20% of our death row prisoners weren't even supposed to be there by the jury, who by the Constitution is supposed to be the one deciding their fate.
I can see it if it was a horrific, violent crime like a mass shooting or children,
a serial
minors.
Killer.
Yeah, murder, like something like that. But for circumstantial evidence with no DNA, no physical evidence being linked to the defendant, it should have never have gotten this far. He should have never even been in trial, to be honest. He should have never been charged with it. But
I mean, every step of the way, it's just a complete cluster. And there is actually a list of people who judicial override was used on. Y'all get ready for this. So you've got Rocky's name of the list of 112 people it's been used on. Robin Rocky Myers. 2 below him, Judith Ann Neely.
Who was later granted clemency, by the way.
Which, actually, this will not be the last time we reference Judith freaking Neely. And as of November of 2020, there are still 35 people on death row due to judicial override, one, of course, being Rocky.
So in Rocky's case, the judge was about to be up for, guess what? Re-election. There is a big frickin' surprise right there. And of course, this is his first death penalty case, and he wants to show the people of Alabama that he is tough on crime. Well, there is a correlation with judges using the override before a re-election. In fact, in 1995, there was a push to make it more strict, like Florida and Delaware. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. Associate Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said it would be micromanaging. Let that sink in. Everywhere else, it is completely illegal.
Yep, 47 states have outlawed it. 2 others have a strict set of criteria, but we don't want to freaking micromanage you? What?
I know. So, Rocky's now on death row. What's next? And we're going to find out right after this break.
Okay, welcome back from the break. So what's next? Well, there's still a lot to come. So Rocky is now on death row. Debbie divorces him as she wants to move on with her life. Rocky actually told her to. Rocky was like, you need to move on. And with death penalty cases, appeals start basically immediately. Rocky's trial lawyers, so this is John Mays and Larry Madison, they filed an appeal which was rejected. One note here, John Mays was actually infuriated by the judicial override, and he offered to represent Rocky pro bono if they would give him a new trial, and he argued basically everything that we just talked about. But alas, it was legal at the time, so it was denied. So then starts the habeas corpus process. And this is where you get the chance to fight the process that got you here, any new evidence. And Casey, who is Rocky's current attorney, says that one good way to explain it is that direct appeals are record-based. And if it didn't happen on the record, you can't talk about it. So let's say a juror is having an affair with a prosecutor you can't talk about it. But here you can raise all sorts of issues. You can complain about the lawyers. You can bring up whatever you want.
So you can't bring up the fact that one of your star witnesses was bada bing, bada boom, the defendant?
If it ain't on the record, you can't say it.
Well, at the time, Alabama didn't automatically appoint someone for you for this process, so you had to pretty much go out and find your own. So in 1998, there's this young attorney named Earl Swartz who said that he would represent Rocky pro bono since it was a death penalty case. Swartz worked on Rocky's case for several years, and then in 2004, Rocky gets a letter in the mail. It was a ton of legalese in it, so it was really hard for him to read. He couldn't understand it, so he had another inmate read it to him and kind of explain it to him. Turns out Rocky's post-conviction appeal had been denied, so federal habeas petition needed to be filed if he was going to continue to fight. This had to be filed within a certain time frame. The problem is, Rocky's hadn't been filed. It wasn't done. That was it. So his next step was the execution date. But here's the question. Why didn't Earl Swartz get it done?
He was on a time frame. This had to be filed if he was going to continue the fight or the date for execution is set. Earl Swartz ditched Rocky. He just quit. He did not tell anyone. He didn't tell Rocky. He did not inform the court. He did not tell anyone. He just left. He just dropped his client. And he admits it. He says, I got too busy. I got too overwhelmed. And in 2005, he was issued a censure for it, which is basically your name gets put on a naughty list. That's it. You don't lose your license, nothing like that. You're like published in the lawyer newspaper or something as, slap on the wrist. But this was a critical time to drop Rocky because this is the process where you're really fighting, you're looking for new evidence, and they did. They got new evidence. So let's go back for just a moment. You remember our friend Marzell Ewing? He was the one who was arrested for stealing the car. He said, yes, I saw Robin Myers sell the VCR. I'm one of Rocky's friends, and we keep saying you can't trust him. Well, he signs a new statement. He comes forward, and he's got something to say.
He says in his original statement that, it just wasn't truthful. He did not see who brought in the VCR to the shot house that night. And he says, quote, I did not see who brought the VCR to the shot house that night. Detective Boyd told me that he would take the stolen car that I had been driving and just leave it by the side of the road. The cop who had arrested him said, you say it's Rocky, and I will take the stolen car and leave it on the side of the road.
This is basically, I guess you would call it witness tampering. And if you go back, think about all of the stories that don't add up. Think about the people who were saying this all along. Think about how we kept saying, can you trust what people are saying? You've got a guy who just came forward to claim a $5,000 reward. His timeline doesn't match up. We find out now he stopped at a whole other place on the way. And the police are now, we know, telling people that we'll drop this off your record, which keep in mind, when Butch and Roadrunner were taking that VCR, or were they? We don't know. But one story says that Butch and Roadrunner were taking the VCR. Roadrunner said that the police had told Butch that they would make their felonies go away. And we said, well, we don't know if they said that or not. Hell, maybe they did.
And wasn't Tyrone's brother a police officer?
He sure was. But there's two problems with this because new evidence, right? Witness tampering, that's big. But one, Rocky admitted to selling the VCR. So it didn't change anything. Just because Marzell didn't see him sell it, Rocky said, I sold it. But the bigger problem is maybe the information isn't new, but the whole structure of how they conducted that investigation is now in question. But the second problem is Rocky still missed this deadline. it's still, this whole appeal still had to be filed by a certain date, and it wasn't done. Whatever the reason, it wasn't done. So, nothing. They got nothing.
Now back to Earl Swartz. Since the state at the time didn't have to provide this counsel, they couldn't do anything. Earl Swartz had offered to represent Rocky. So because he was not appointed by the court, there's really nothing that they can do now. And beyond that, according to the article in The Nation, the state of Alabama argued that Swartz's failings were irrelevant, contending that the burden had been on Rocky to stay on top of his case. And the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit agreed. Now, this is going to be a huge sticking point for later on. Now, remember, Rocky can read at a third grade level at this point. Somebody had to read him that letter. So how on earth is he going to be able to stay on top of his case?
We've seen some of these documents. Jen and I both have college degrees, and it was even
challenging,
kind of hard to understand. So what on earth? And Rocky gave a quote to that article in The Nation where he said, "A lot of people think that people on death row know the law. They know this or that, but I don't. I give all my trust to my attorneys and stuff. If I could read the law in the books and learn and study, I would. But I'm not able to do that. I'm not a learnable type of person." Again, much more to come on that soon.
So as far as the legal avenue goes, this is pretty much done. Rocky only has one last hope, and that is the governor of Alabama, Kay Ivey. After this, two new people enter the case. This is Casey Keaton, the attorney, and Sarah Romano, the investigator. These two women are still on his case today, and we have been so fortunate to have spoken to them several times about the case. They are compassionate, they're smart, they're committed, and, I mean, to be honest, hands up respect.
I mean, they've dealt with us. They've talked to us and answered all of our questions. So, yeah. Casey and Sarah come in and they see all the pitfalls in this case immediately. But they have one approach that no one has fought yet, surprisingly. So we've alluded to it a lot in this story, and it's about to become a big deal. So the 8th Amendment to the Constitution talks about cruel and unusual punishment and what qualifies as such. And it states that an intellectually disabled person cannot be put to death. So they're like, I wonder if there's something here. So they get to digging, and as it turns out, there is a ton of documentation to support this. They found old teachers of Rocky's who were able to show that he had been in learning disability classes. They find all these tests that have been administered to him. Literally, there are probably 30 or 40 documents of test results and classes and grades that go to support this.
The very first one, which is a form from a special education teacher, flat out says Rocky's records state that he was functioning as, quote, mental defective, and that was just the term they used during that time. She specifies that when he was 11, 6th grade, his reading comprehension was a 3rd grade level. Other subjects were as low as the 1st grade. And it didn't seem as if they were really ever going up by much. It was a tremendous struggle for him. They had his IQ tested, and it put him in the 2nd percentile, which is usually anything under 5th percentile is considered intellectually disabled. Now, another shows where a school psychologist gave Rocky an IQ test on which he received a 64. Now, the line for an intellectual disability is 75, and it has to show before the age of 18, which this clearly did. In fact, they found several test scores. So altogether, we got at age 11 was 75, right on the line. At the age of 12, he gets a 64, a verbal IQ score of 71, and a performance IQ score of 64. Now, Dr. Loreo reported Mr. Myers was mentally defective based on this test performance. Say that's not good enough. So now we're at the age of 16. His FSIQ, 71. a PIQ of 74, and a VIQ of 70. So what they're doing with these tests, these are comprehension IQ tests. So they take a look at reading, writing, comprehension, and application. It's a test where they start off really basic and they get higher and higher. And when you start missing them, they go back a little bit and then go forward again, just to kind of, was it that one question or was it many questions? So they're looking at your ability to articulate, repeat, read, and comprehend. These are very extensive tests. They are not just one sitting and done.
Again, all of these are all before the age of 18, and they are all within the range. The range is 75. The highest one we've got here is 75, and the oldest age is 16. So he is, as of right now, there's no question. They even talked to tons of people who knew him, friends, family, and a lot of them talked about some of the things that we referred to in episode 1. They said he had trouble understanding directions in sports, sometimes lacked common sense, which one of his brothers said that he almost drank bleach one time because he thought it was a drink, and that he once rode a bike down a hill knowing that the brakes were broken. So just things like that. And then his now ex-wife, Debbie, signed affidavits talking about how she had to fill out job applications for him because he had difficulty remembering details. And she also talks about how she had to control the money. And we talked about this on that night where he went out and he didn't have money. And his mother-in-law called Debbie and said, "Do you want me to give him money?" Because he was bad with math and he couldn't keep up with it. He would overspend, but he didn't even realize it. Also, they kind of hinted at the possibility of a genetic component because Debbie said that one of the children was in special education classes as well. And also, Rocky was not the only one of his siblings who was in special education classes. So it's not like he just didn't try in school or he didn't show up to school and that affected his learning. It seems like there's actually a genetic component to it.
Now, a childhood friend said that he realized Rocky had trouble reading growing up with him. And he is quoted as saying, "This girl Bridget used to have parties and we would go quite often, maybe once a month. And once we were there was a note on the door. And since he was the first one on the porch, we asked him, 'There's no music playing, the lights were off. What did it say?' He said that they were not having it, and then one of the other guys ran up and said that they went out to get chips and soda and they'll be back whatever time it was." So, there's this note on this door. He goes up. He's not really reading it. He's not understanding it. So when another friend goes up and reads it, they're like, "No, the party's still happening. They went to get refreshments."
So this is awesome news, right? We've got an avenue to travel down. So they present it. But then Dr. Glenn King evaluated Rocky in 2006 and reported an IQ score of 84. Now remember, our line is 75 and you have to see signs of it before age 18. Well, in 2005, he's in his 40s, I guess, 30s maybe, and he gets an 84. Of course, you've got 4 other tests showing he's at or below the line before the age of 18. But here's this one by George saying that he got an 84, so he's not intellectually disabled. They said, nope, he doesn't qualify.
So let's pause on the intellectual debate for just a second, because in the meantime, in 2012, the execution date is scheduled for Rocky. Since his trial, the electrocution chair is no longer in use, and they're able to move to lethal injection. He and several other prisoners file a suit arguing the safety of it. A stay of execution was granted to Rocky, so his new team decided to get him evaluated again. In 2013, because they know the score of 84 has to be an outlier, they get an expert to administer several tests to determine the IQ. Now, important note, 2 of the tests they couldn't interpret because his reading was so low for these to be valid indicators of his functioning. He received a 73.
So we're still below the line. We've still got, this is the 6th test, 5 of which are at or below the line. So why the big outlier test score? Where did this 84 come from? Well, the person who performed the one in 2013 made a lot of notes and said that there were some problems from that test that was administered where he got the 84. So for one, he was using a different version of the test than all the others. Number 2, there's a thing called the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect concerns the fact that full-scale IQ test scores have been shown to increase an average of 0.3 points every year from the time the test was originally given. So the test kind of becomes outdated over time because of that. You have to give them the new methods because you're learning over time, you're learning how the test is over time. So the more time that has gone by since the test was normed, as they call it, the less accurate the results are going to be. Also, he relied solely on Rocky's self-report to assess his adaptive functioning. Well, of course, you may not necessarily realize that you're not doing something the same way someone else is. So if you say, hey, Jen, are you good at, I don't know, knitting? You can say, yeah, because you tried it one time and it, you know what I'm saying? But if you ask someone who's been doing it for 20 years, they may say something different. And this is why you're supposed to ask other people, how does he react in these type of situations? How does he do with this? Because when you talk to his wife, he couldn't keep up with the money and all that. And then the last issue is he was not assessed in a typical community-based environment. So when you're observing someone, you're seeing them at home, at school, in their business with people their age and all that. Well, Rocky was assessed at this time in a prison setting. It's a controlled environment. There's no opportunity for independent functioning. So the version of the test he used was done in a prison setting where he should have used a different type that didn't rely on that. But again, they hit this dead end because of this one score that happened after the age of 18, well after the age of 18.
So when they're talking about the adaptive skills, they're saying, you know, how often do you shower? Well, Rocky's going to say every day because that's part of his routine. The guards lead him to the shower. Now, would he be showering every day if the guards did not take him to do that?
Don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, he is answering based on his routine rather than self-independence. Then in 2017, a breakthrough comes. Now, let's go back to the judicial override because we know only 3 states are using it. In 2016, Delaware and Florida outlawed it, leaving Alabama on its own. Then in 2017, the Alabama Supreme Court declared it is now unconstitutional. Cool. So it's illegal now, which is awesome. Let's go back and fix all the ones that it happened to because it violates their constitutional rights now. All right, not so fast. Alabama has used this thing like it's sugar in tea. Go back and do this would take a lot of time and money. But to be fair, it's their screw up. Go back and fix your screw ups.
They said it would take a lot of time and money. Well, hell, we found the list of 112 prisoners that it's been used on. Go through that list and just say, whatever sentence you got, take it down a notch. If we found it, okay, so you got to file some paperwork. Look, I will pay for you. I will pay for you to go back and do this. So they determined that it would not be retroactive because of this. So now what you've got is a process that has been applied to 112 people. Now, granted, some of them have since been executed. So whatever that number is now, you've got a process that was used to give them their sentence. You have now said it is unconstitutional against the foundation of our whole government. It still applies to them just because it's too much to go back and fix it. So now they have an unconstitutional sentence against them.
So since Casey and Sarah have been on the case, they went back and talked to several people involved. At least one of the original jurors used a derogatory racial slur when talking about Rocky. Yeah, ones we don't repeat. So here we are, 2021. It seems like every and any little thing that could have gone wrong in this case literally did. As of now, the only thing keeping Rocky from having a date set is that they gave the death row prisoners options. So there's a new version of the gas chamber. Rocky chose the gas. But since it's so new, it hasn't been approved yet, and there's not really a process in place for it. Which, another thing that blows my mind in prisons is why give this option when it's not an option?
Well, see, what they did is when they filed that lawsuit to say, there were all those problems with lethal injection a few years back where they argued, was it cruel and unusual? And they said, okay, well, here's the other option for now. You can opt for this. We don't have all the details worked out, so we can't say it's any better, but we'll give you that option. Well, since it's not approved officially yet, it's at least buying him time at this point. That's essentially where we're at.
So again, his last hope now is for clemency from Governor Kay Ivey, which Casey and Sarah are fighting for. At first, Rocky had all but given up. He told them that he didn't want to beg for his life, but they said that they would do the fighting, and it might help somebody else if it caused them to look at their similar cases. Only then Rocky agreed to it. Not for himself, but for others.
And Casey was very straightforward with Rocky. She said, look, the chances are slim, but it's worth trying. And in fact, she told him that the last time clemency was granted to someone in Alabama was, wait for it, to a white woman in the 80s on the governor's last day in office. Does that ring a bell? Because it should. It was Judith Ann freaking Neely again.
Casey and Sarah have created a website at clemencyforrockymyers.wordpress.com, which we will have in the show notes. You can actually see a lot of the documents there. Yeah, on there you can see the clemency video that they created for our previous governor. And you can also find it on YouTube by searching Rocky Myers clemency video.
So at this point, as you know, we're helping gather letters to be a part of his clemency package. We are aiming for his sentence to be commuted to life in prison without parole, as the jury originally said. And here's one more thing that pisses me off. This is the best we can hope for because, wait for it, the Judith Ann Neely law. That's the third time this woman's come up.
You said that wrong. Judith Ann freaking Neely law.
The Judith Ann freaking Neely law, which if you flash back to the Judith freaking Ann Neely story, her sentence was taken from death to life with parole. Remember, we wrote letters for that too because she was up for parole. Well, they changed the law, which at the time we thought it sounded great because we're like, oh, well, they made it to where you can't change someone from death to life. It has to be life without parole. And we thought that was great in the Judith Ann Neely story. Well, now it's come to bite us in the butt.
Pretty much.
Because now, if the governor wanted to, she can't change it. And it would have to come from the Board of Pardons and Paroles. But in order to be eligible for parole, you have to have served 75% of your sentence. Well, this is a death sentence. You can't serve 75% of a death sentence, which is why we're hoping that it gets commuted to life without parole. And that's where we are today. Like we said, that wraps up the actual story. So it wasn't just problems with the actual story itself and the witnesses. It was the whole legal thing. His lawyer ditched him. On the 31st, 7 p.m., live Q&A. We're going to see if Casey and Sarah will join us. Haven't been able to ask them yet. Don't know. But we will have that up as an episode as well. And then the last episode will be all of the interviews, which will include Rocky Myers himself. So we're really excited for you guys to hear from everyone. Y'all know we're passionate about it. So
yeah, we're not going to play the all 3 interviews in the episode just because it it could be a little bit long, but you can hear all of them on Patreon in full. So we want to make sure all of our Patreon listeners are able to hear the interviews from start to finish. You're going to really enjoy it. I think at one point, Lindsay gets so mad she knocks her mic off her.
I do, yeah.
You really did.
That's true. I forgot about that because it's actually been a while since we talked to Casey and Sarah, but they've been great. They've emailed us and, just random information they think of and all that. Speaking of, one of the things that they told us just this week, if anyone is curious about John Mays representing the Klan, you will have a chance because CNN is coming out with a docuseries. It's a 4-part docuseries about the biggest case that John Mays represented the Klan on. And it's called The State versus the Klan. And it airs in mid-April, I believe. We'll give you some more details. For some reason, I want to say like April 11th, but it's somewhere mid-April.
We've reached out to CNN and we have not had a response yet.
Lord knows I tried. It ain't for lack of trying, but you never know. But yeah, it's a horrible story. It's one of those big civil rights spurring stories, and it starts with a lynching, and then there's the trial of the people involved, and then it moves on to the actual suit against the Klan, and that's where we don't know if he's in it. We don't know if his name is mentioned. We don't know if his face is seen, but it is the case. So you will have that chance.
I will definitely be watching with bated breath and probably a margarita because I'm going to throw something at the TV if I don't.
Yeah, but as you watch it, keep in mind that is the same man who years later will go on to represent Rocky Myers. And it's just hard to fathom, even though, like I said, I think there are some things he did that were really great.
I am so perplexed with him because, offering pro bono, but then again, he is a very complex person where we can't just look at him from one lens and tell a narrative of a complete person that way. It is more complex. We did reach out to him.
You never know how or if people change. You don't know. We don't know. We, like Jen said, we tried to reach out and we just don't know. So we can't say.
We will find out more next episode when we release those interviews. But until then, guys, we are almost there. Stay safe for you and yours. But until then, you know what they said to Felicia.
Bye.
Bye.